Okay, hi guys. Today we're going to learn a little bit about one of the reasons why Germany was defeated in World War II. Okay, we learned about how Germany and Hitler in particular took actions which contributed to the outbreak of World War II. Okay, right now we're going to look at why Germany and Hitler were not able to continue, dominating Europe as they did, and how they eventually collapsed and fell to the Allied powers. So today we're going to focus on the role of the USA. Okay, so for today we're going to look at a little bit of background on what the USA's position was with regard to World War II. We're going to look at how the USA was indirectly involved in World War II on the side of the Allies, but at the time it was just supporting but not having a direct role yet. And then finally, how the US had a direct role in World War II itself, and how its direct role helped to bring about the end of World War II by helping the Allies defeat Germany in particular. Okay, that will be our focus for today. Okay, so essentially, just to give you a brief summary, there were three main causes for Germany's defeat in World War II. So firstly, as we talked about, it was due to the USA's involvement. It was also due to German weaknesses and miscalculations. Okay, something that we'll deal with later on. And finally, okay, you had the strengths of the US, the weaknesses of the Germans, and of course the Allied powers themselves, Allied resistance. For example, on the part of the British, on the part of the Soviet Union, for example, okay, as a form of resistance against the Axis powers, and particularly Germany. Okay, we're gonna by the end of this chapter, we look at the interrelationship between these few factors. Okay, so the topic inquiry question for this chapter, or this part of the chapter, is: was the entry of the USA in 1941 the main cause of Germany's defeat in World War II? So if you think about the key words, okay, you look at entry of the USA, the USA's entry into the war itself, and whether this caused the defeat of Germany in World War II. How important was the USA's role in contributing to the defeat of Germany? Okay, so a little bit of background about the USA. Okay, essentially, when we think about the USA in the 1920s and the 1930s, basically isolationist sentiments were very strong, which meant that the USA saw itself as being isolated from places like Europe, places like Asia. Okay, they basically wanted to keep to themselves. They didn't want to get involved, in the affairs of other countries. And if you remember correctly, Woodrow Wilson over here, the American president, he was the guy who came up with the idea of the League of Nations. His 14 points helped to guide the formation of the League of Nations after World War One. But eventually, the USA itself was not part of the League of Nations simply because the isolationist sentiments were so strong on the ground that Wilson couldn't compel his fellow compatriots to take part in the League of Nations. So why were these isolationist sentiments so strong? Okay, so firstly, there was of course the Great Depression, the fact that America was hit so badly, it couldn't really take care of itself already. So why go and get involved in the affairs of other countries? Also, the horrors of World War One, America having lost so many troops in a foreign land, so far away, okay, caused a lot of people to not want to get involved in another such war so far away from its own country. It wanted to mind its own business, essentially. And finally, the fact that the USA was geographically isolated from places like Europe and Asia, separated by the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, okay, they basically felt that they could afford to keep to themselves because events that had happened elsewhere, like in Europe, for example, wouldn't necessarily affect them simply because they were so geographically isolated from the rest of these countries. So one particular act that you need to take note of was the Neutrality Act, and this was passed in 1931. So if you look at the title itself, neutrality, it comes from the word neutral, which means that the USA didn't really take sides, okay, when it came to conflicts out of the USA. So based on this cartoon, what was the purpose of the Neutrality Act? So if you look at this cartoon over here, this little bird guy over here who represents, Uncle Sam, the American symbol. He's basically driving this ship, which is supposed to carry all-out aid to our allies. But if you look at the shape of the ship, it is round basically, and basically if he drives over here, the only thing that can happen is for this ship to go round and round and round in circles, which means that the aid couldn't possibly be delivered to the Allies itself. So during this time, in the 1930s, and the USA really wanted to be neutral, and they didn't want to take sides and didn't really want to help other countries. Okay, they wanted to keep to themselves and stay neutral. Again, mind my own business, that kind of attitude. Okay, so this Neutrality Act was passed in 1937 to ensure that the USA wouldn't become involved in a foreign war. Okay, so some features of the Neutrality Act included, okay, the prohibition of American ships from transporting passengers or materials to warring countries. So, to prevent American ships from getting tangled up in conflicts abroad. Okay, there was also a forbidding of US citizens from traveling on ships to warring nations. Again, trying to limit American involvement overseas, especially when it comes to conflicts overseas. And does anyone know who this is? Okay, I'm sure most of you will have seen him, and most of you may remember him. He's Franklin Roosevelt, the American president during this time. Okay, during the time the Neutrality Act was passed. Okay, so right now, we think about Roosevelt, we think about the USA's indirect involvement at first. Okay, so essentially when we look at indirect involvement, we look at how the USA was involved without being part of the Allied forces. Okay, so basically it played more of a supporting role at the beginning. So how did the Allies support how did the USA support the Allies in the war in Europe without being directly involved? So at this time, the USA wasn't exactly at war with Germany or Japan, for example. Okay, so firstly, there was this cash and carry policy that the USA adopted in 1939, which basically made it move away from the Neutrality Act. So instead of staying neutral and keeping out of others' affairs, the Cash and Carry Act was put in place. And this allowed Britain and France to buy arms from the USA. So if you look at the date, September 1939, okay, this was when World War II started, basically when Germany invaded Poland, causing Britain and France to declare war on Germany. So the cash and carry program allowed Britain and France to buy arms, okay, military materials from the USA on a cash and carry basis. However, as the term cash and carry implies, okay, they could buy US produced weapons but had to pay cash up front, so that's where cash comes in, and had to settle their own transportation to bring these weapons back to Europe. So they have to carry these US goods back home on their own. Okay, so that was the Cash and Carry Act. So this was what was important in keeping the British and the French fighting against the Germans, because they could basically rely on US produced weapons. Okay, and however, another step was taken about 1.5 years later. So from the Cash and Carry Act, we moved to the Land-Lease Act, and this Land-Lease Act was basically an improvement on the cash and carry policy, because Britain's resources was drained by 1940, and by June 1940, Britain was the only country left standing in Western Europe. So basically, Britain stood alone in resisting the Nazis. Okay, so if you look over here, okay, by June 1940, for example, you realize that all these parts in red were basically under German or Nazi control. So even France had fallen to Nazi control, and the only country in Western Europe, this part, which remained standing, was the United Kingdom over here. Okay, so it was left standing on its own. And under the Lend-Lease Act, the USA could supply food, weapons, and equipment to Britain and other countries whose defense was deemed vital or important to US security. Okay, and therefore this Lend-Lease Act was later extended to the USSR, okay, in June 1941. So if you look over here, okay, basically 1941, later we'll learn more about this, but the Germans also invaded the Soviet Union, and when they did this, the Lend-Lease Act was then also extended to the USSR. Okay, so essentially it was to help Britain really sustain its war effort and to prevent it from falling to the Germans, okay, just as France had just done a little bit before. Okay, so the Lend-Lease Act essentially allowed the payment for weapons to be deferred, so you can pay later on. You don't have to pay cash up front. You could pay later on, so it was essentially a little bit of a loan. Okay, the term lend kind of implies that it was a loan. Okay, you can take the weapons now, but you pay later on. Okay, and also the Lend-Lease Act gave the Allies a fresh injection of supplies and resources needed to fight Germany. So Britain basically it was standing on its own. Its resources were running so low that it had to rely on the USA to supply them with these important resources to keep it fighting against the Germans, to prevent Britain from falling. Okay, another way that America was indirectly involved in World War II was through this approach called the Arsenal of Democracy. So an arsenal is basically a place where weapons are kept. Okay, and if you look at arsenal over here is like a cannon. Okay, essentially it is there to defend democracy. Okay, so basically the Arsenal of Democracy basically embodied this idea that the USA should actively support democratic nations such as Britain in their fight against the Axis powers. So the USA would provide the support, would provide the sort of the cannons over here to help support democratic nations like Britain, because the USA itself was democratic, unlike countries like Nazi Germany, which weren't. Okay, and therefore the USA increased aid to Britain after France fell to Germany in 1940. So it didn't just say that we would protect democratic nations, they actually did something concrete to help countries like Britain. So for example, 50 old destroyers, which were basically ships, okay, navy ships, they were given to Britain in exchange for 8 naval bases in the Caribbean. Okay, so at this time, Britain, although they were 50 old destroyers, they helped the British Navy sustain itself against German attacks. And because of this arsenal of democracy, okay, closer bonds were forged between the USA and Britain. So you look over here, this is President Roosevelt. He frequently corresponded with Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Britain over here. So they had a very, very close relationship, and even today, this is known as the special relationship between the USA and Britain. Okay, in response, because Britain and France were so close to Britain and the USA were close to one another, Germany and Italy, which were already under the Rome-Berlin Axis, they joined Japan in the Tripartite Pact in 1940. And essentially, these three countries joined together would form what we now know as the Axis powers. Okay, and this committed the three countries to mutual political, military, and economic assistance. Basically, they would help one another during the course of the war. Okay, and in helping to protect democracy, Roosevelt, okay, in short FDR, also planned to expand the US Army and Navy and stepped up the process of rearmament. So he saw what's happening around the world, and he felt that what's happening around the world, contrary to popular opinion, would eventually affect the USA. So he stepped up the process of rearmament to build up the US military in preparation for a possible war. So the Allies, like Britain, they were provided with psychological and material support during a very difficult period. Okay, and this allowed the Allies to gain military superiority. Okay, the fact that they were psychologically boosted and also materially boosted by the USA. okay, in providing help through the Lend-Lease Act, for example. Okay, so basically there's a fireside chat. Roosevelt liked to sit by the fireside to give radio broadcasts to the American people, and people will sit by the fireside to listen to the radio broadcasts by Roosevelt. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly read this. There are many among us who in the past closed their eyes to events abroad because they believed what some of their fellow Americans told them, that what was taking place in Europe was none of their business, that no matter what happened over there, the United States could always pursue its peaceful and unique course in the world. So basically, there are people who really believe that whatever took place in Europe would not really affect them. And he goes on to say that there are many among us who closed their eyes from lack of interest or lack of knowledge, honesty, and sincerely thinking that many hundreds of miles of salt water made the American hemisphere so remote that the people of North and Central and South America could go on living in the midst of their vast resources without reference to or danger from other countries of the world. Today, however, we are more realistic. Let us be done with both fears and illusions. On this evening in our homes, in the midst of our American families, let us calmly consider what we have done and what we must do. So essentially, Roosevelt seems to be persuading the American people to change their thinking, to basically throw away the isolationist sentiment, the belief that they could survive on their own, they could mind their own business. They had to change their approach to affairs abroad. Okay, so essentially, the message of FDR here was that he wanted them to end isolationism. And also there were other forms of aid, indirect forms of aid, okay, that the U.S. provided to the allies. One of them was the escort role. So the U.S. Navy escorted Allied convoys at sea after being attacked by U-boats in late 1941. So these escorts basically helped to keep the Allied convoys safe. Okay, and they were able to cross the seas safely. And also they had economic sanctions on the Axis powers. So resources like iron were restricted to deprive the Axis powers of resources needed for the war. So basically the USA stopped providing important resources like iron to the Axis powers. Even though not being part of the League of Nations, they were not exactly obligated to do so. Okay, and Japan's U.S. assets were also frozen when Japan invaded Indochina in 1941. And basically these economic sanctions were very important because they contributed to the weakening of the Axis powers, as the Axis powers saw their supplies increasingly drained. Countries like Germany, Japan, and Italy, they couldn't sustain the war effort because they didn't have an unlimited amount of supplies. Okay, so because of these economic sanctions, it really dealt a blow to the Axis powers. Okay, so the question now to ask is, how did the USA move from a position of indirect involvement to a position of direct involvement? Okay, essentially, being directly involved means being on the side of the Allies, entering the frame of war itself. Okay, so you can just watch this short video here. Alright, so now that you've seen the video, essentially what the scene depicted was the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was a massive base located in Hawaii, a massive naval base owned by the Americans on the island of Hawaii. Okay, so it was a secret attack. As you saw, all the people were caught off guard, and it really caught America by surprise. Okay, and it happened on the 7th of December 1941, and it's famously known as the Day of Infamy. Okay, an infamous day. Okay, where America was suddenly attacked by the Japanese. And essentially, when America was attacked by the Japanese in such a manner, okay, America basically declared war on Japan, and Hitler, with Germany being an ally of the Japanese. Remember, they promised to support one another. Hitler had no choice but to declare war on the USA, simply because the USA had declared war on Japan. Okay, so that's how America got involved in World War II and on the European front as well. Okay, so America was the world's largest industrial power, and it could produce military resources at a rapid rate. Okay, and compared to the Axis powers like Japan, Germany, and Italy, okay, these Axis powers really couldn't keep up with the rate of production that the USA was enjoying. And factories which previously made things like cars, machine parts, okay, they were all easily converted to military production. So, for example, a factory traditionally used to build cars, for example, could easily be converted to one that built tanks, okay, which could then help in the war effort. Okay, and not only did the USA help to contribute a lot of resources to the Allied effort, the USA also sent a great number of US military personnel to aid the Allied military campaign. So if you look at this chart over here, you see that okay, Britain had 4.5 million people, soldiers involved in World War II, but America basically sent 11 million, okay, 11 million American soldiers to help fight against the Axis powers. Okay, and that was almost as many as the number that the Germans sent. But remember, the Germans were fighting against the Soviet Union, against the USA, against Britain. So when you combine all the manpower that the Allies enjoyed, okay, they basically really overwhelmed what the Axis powers had. Okay, so what kind of impact would they have? Essentially, the USA in joining the war and being directly involved helped to turn the tide of the war in the favor of the Allies. So the Allies were no longer necessarily on the defensive. They could now go and reverse the tide of the war to put Germany on the defensive. Okay, and the US participation also helped the Allies achieve control of the air and the sea, okay, because of their military superiority. And when you have control of the air, okay, the Allies were able to destroy many German cities, military sites, and oil fields. So you look at the P-40 Warhawk fighters over here, which were sent by the Americans. Okay, these helped to devastate many German cities, especially cities, industrial cities, which were very prominent in building weapons, for example. Okay, and this really helped to slow down the war production of Germany itself, and by bombing oil fields as well, it really slowed down the war effort simply because Germans really relied on oil to keep the war effort going. Okay, and therefore when you control the air, okay, you help to slow the production of war materials, like I've said. Germany was forced to focus on anti-aircraft guns, okay, dealing with the threat of these planes, for example, rather than on tanks. So anti-aircraft guns are of course defensive in nature, and tanks are more offensive in nature actually. So it really helped play a part in putting Germany on the back foot. Okay, and the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, lost control of the air. Okay, and also like I said, the Allies were able to gain naval supremacy, and the Allies here had important bases in the mid-Atlantic. So if you look at all these blue color bases, yeah, these were essentially the Allied bases over here. So if you look over here, you see the USA and the Atlantic separating the USA from Europe over here. By having control of the mid-Atlantic over here, it allowed the USA to easily send troops and supplies over here to help aid the Allied effort in Europe. Okay, and so the Allies were therefore able to produce longer range aircraft which successfully attacked German U-boats and planes as well. Okay, so having control of the sea was very important as well, because these helped them to basically attack German U-boats and really clear the way, which eventually led to a more military collaboration, which resulted in the DDay landings, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, and not only that, the Allies were able to produce better equipment like anti-submarine weapons, radio communications, and radar. Okay, which again helped them gain supremacy of the seas. And therefore, eventually the Germans were forced to recall the U-boats, and U-boats were basically the German submarines. Okay, they called Unterboats, which were basically Untersee boats, under the sea boats. In 1943, these were basically so overwhelmed by the superior Allied technologies that the Germans were forced to recall the U-boats in 1943, and this essentially gave the Allies supremacy at sea. Okay, and like I said, both air and sea control basically gave the Allies tactical success, and the D-Day landings, okay, were made possible. Okay, basically, they landed in northern France. Okay, so I'm talking about D-Day landings. Basically, what happened was that the Allied forces, okay, the Germans were busy fighting with the Soviets over here. The Allied forces could land their troops over here in northern France, which basically opened up a second front. So now Germany would have to fight over here and over here as well. And the landings here were successful because they started to push basically the tide of the war, to push the Germans back. They set the Germans on the back foot, causing them to basically retreat and lose ground over here. And you see it's blue over here for the Allied and red over here initially, but what happened after the D-Day landings was that you would see an increasing blue, basically the color of blue would increase and then push them all the way back to Germany. So basically the D-Day landings was important. It was a turning point in the sense that from then on Germany was on the back foot, and this resulted in eventual Allied victory. Okay, so when you think about how the USA helped to contribute to German defeat, okay, think about how the indirect involvement can help the Allies sustain their war effort, and how the direct involvement helped to turn the tide of the war, okay, through the American military superiority. Okay, thank you.